The average adult makes 35,000 conscious decisions every single day, according to behavioral researchers. We decide what to eat, when to cross the street, how to respond to an email. Most of these choices are low stakes, but for a specific group of people, a significant portion of their daily decisions revolves around conscious, manual operation of their own endocrine system to prevent their organs from shutting down. Today, we're examining an article from My Adrenal Life titled Decision Fatigue, the Mental Load of Staying Alive. It details the invisible, ongoing cognitive strain of living with adrenal insufficiency. Rachel, this piece frames the exhaustion of this condition not as a physical deficit alone, but as a profound psychological weight.
The article captures a reality that medical charts often miss. Adrenal insufficiency, whether primary like Addison's disease or secondary, means the body cannot produce adequate amounts of cortisol. Because the automatic feedback loop that regulates this hormone is broken, the patient must become their own adrenal glands. They must consciously monitor their environment, their stress levels, and their physical symptoms to decide when and how much synthetic hormone to take.
People hear the word cortisol and associate it with the stress response, the fight or flight mechanism. The popular narrative suggests cortisol is a harmful chemical we need to reduce through meditation and green tea.
That is a pervasive misunderstanding. Cortisol is a vital regulation hormone. Medical literature from the Cleveland Clinic outlines that it manages blood pressure, regulates blood sugar, dictates the sleep-wake cycle, and controls inflammation. In a healthy body, the hypothalamus and pituitary glands constantly monitor the blood and signal the adrenal glands to release precise microdoses of cortisol throughout the day. The levels peak right before you wake up to get you out of bed, and they surge if you have to swerve in traffic to avoid a collision. The process is dynamic and automatic.
With adrenal insufficiency, that automatic transmission is stripped out of the vehicle. The driver is forced to operate a manual transmission, but instead of shifting gears for speed, they are shifting gears to keep the engine from catching fire. They are performing manual life support.
That analogy illustrates the burden well. When the internal system is impaired, every external event requires a conscious calculation. A patient might wake up and take their baseline dose of hydrocortisone. Then they get a flat tire on the way to work, or they catch a mild stomach bug, or they have a tense argument. A functional body pumps out extra cortisol to handle the physiological demand of those stressors. The person with adrenal insufficiency has to stop and ask themselves questions. Is this stressor significant enough to require an updose? If I do not take extra medication, will my blood pressure drop to a dangerous level? If I take too much, am I risking long-term side effects?
The history of how we treat this condition adds a fascinating layer to this modern burden. Before we had the technology to synthesize these hormones, the diagnosis was a death sentence.
Thomas Addison, a British physician, first described the condition in 1855. At that time, the primary cause of the destruction of the adrenal glands was tuberculosis. Addison noted the systemic weakness, the distinct hyperpigmentation of the skin, and the inevitable decline of the patients. For almost a century after his discovery, there was no effective treatment. Patients deteriorated as their bodies lost the ability to retain sodium and manage basic metabolic functions.
The mid-20th century altered that trajectory. The synthesis of cortisone transformed Addison's disease from a fatal illness into a manageable chronic condition. But looking at it through the lens of this article, that medical victory had an unseen cost.
The synthesis of adrenal hormones was a monumental medical triumph. It gave people their lives back. However, the medical establishment viewed the problem as solved. You replace the missing hormone with a pill, and the patient goes on their way. What researchers and endocrinologists are only now acknowledging is the psychological toll of that intervention. Medicine saved the physical body, but transferred the burden of survival onto the patient's conscious mind.
That transfer of burden is the core of the My Adrenal Life article. It is the shift from a biological process to a cognitive one. The article notes that this mental load shows up in small, repeated moments. It is not always a dramatic medical emergency. It is the quiet, continuous background processing.
Research published in the journal PubMed highlights that adults with adrenal cortisol insufficiency often report significant cognitive dysfunction, especially in memory processing and executive function. They experience persistent fatigue that does not resolve with sleep. This is often misdiagnosed as depression or poor coping skills. The reality is mechanical. The brain is exhausted from acting as an endocrine organ. Every physical sensation has to be evaluated. A headache might be a routine ache, or it might be the early warning sign of low cortisol.
The article specifies that this cognitive strain applies across all forms of adrenal insufficiency. We have talked mostly about Addison's disease, which is primary adrenal insufficiency. How do the other forms differ, and does the mental load change depending on the specific diagnosis?
The origin of the dysfunction varies, but the end result remains consistent. Primary adrenal insufficiency, or Addison's, means the adrenal glands themselves are damaged, often by an autoimmune response. Secondary adrenal insufficiency occurs when the pituitary gland fails to produce the signal that tells the adrenal glands to work. Tertiary adrenal insufficiency involves a failure at the level of the hypothalamus. There is also iatrogenic adrenal insufficiency, which is steroid-induced. This happens when a patient takes high doses of glucocorticoids for another condition and their own adrenal glands go dormant. Regardless of where the communication breakdown occurs in the brain-adrenal pathway, the patient is left holding the manual controls.
The burden of holding those manual controls requires a heightened state of what psychologists call interoception. That is the ability to perceive physical sensations inside the body. For these patients, interoception becomes a relentless survival skill rather than just a mind-body connection.
A person without this condition might feel a wave of nausea and dismiss it as something they ate. A person with adrenal insufficiency feels that same wave of nausea and has to cross-reference it against their medication schedule, their recent stress levels, and their sleep quality. Nausea is a primary symptom of low cortisol. They have to decide if they need to consume carbohydrates, take a supplemental dose of hydrocortisone, or monitor the feeling for another 20 minutes. That single physical sensation triggers a complex decision tree.